is about pre-modern expressions of humanism. At various times and places around the world from about 500 BCE up until through the Western European Renaissance. And what we find as we look to the use of the word humanism through the ages is that the working definition varies a great deal, depending on the context. Basically, again and again, either at the time or in retrospect, a philosophy is labeled humanist, and it's usually in contrast to or in opposition to something else. For example, humanist might mean putting earthly life at the center of our attention as opposed to putting the gods or the heavens there. It might mean naturalism versus supernaturalism. It might mean materialism in the philosophical sense, which I'll talk about a little bit more, versus believing that there are things that are matter and others that are spirit. Later, humanism gets proposed as an alternative to theism or theocracy. And sometimes it offers an optimistic or positive view of human nature as opposed to a view of us as being fallen or depraved. So there's a sort of definition by negation going on, and that doesn't mean that humanism doesn't have a positive program, although that is a criticism sometimes made that we can look at, especially in the later sessions. I think it means instead in this period that it's kind of a floating term that gets used appropriately to a context, but very differently than in another context. So somebody who's a humanist in one situation might not be at all what's meant by a humanist in another. So we'll keep an eye out for that. But I've pulled these out because one way or another, they all illustrate something that's still really relevant to our contemporary humanism. And I'll pull that out as we go. So I thought we would start, and I realize this is risky, but I trust you, that we're going to use the chat, just a written form, to give our own definition or description or a phrase of what humanism is to us in one sentence, if you care to. Now, we could spend the entire session this way, and I don't want to do that, so we're going to keep it in writing, and I will save the chat. And again, we don't have to attribute that to each person if you wish not to, but I think it would be just really interesting as the time goes forward to see what do we think humanism is and see where that comes up. And I suggest that if each of us uses our own sentence to say our own definition rather than engaging or disagreeing with someone else's, together we'll get a kind of, impressionist portrait of humanism. Lots of separate, incomplete pieces that add up to a very rich picture because it means a lot of different things. So let's do that right now. Just a few minutes to think for yourself and put in the chat, what do you think humanism is? And we'll come back to those surely at our discussion time, as well as along the way. Thanks for kicking us off there, Joe. Recognizing the humanity of every person. There's no God, just us humans here. It's a perspective on life that considers human beings as thinking or sensing beings. The belief that we are responsible for solving our own problems. We can't rely on a deity. A naturalistic philosophy that aspires to the greater good of humanity. Centered around humans, what matters to us, what we experience. Saying that we create the values by which we live, investment in humanity. This is great. We create meaning and value for ourselves in an indifferent universe, and despite considerable evidence that we're pretty poor at it, yeah. Humanism is a philosophy centered on humanity. We must take responsibility for our lives. Yeah, they kind of hang together, although none of them is a complete dictionary definition, perhaps. So I'll preserve all this. Go ahead and keep popping it into the chat. I'm going to turn it off because I can't look at two things at once without getting distracted. But don't worry, it won't be gone. And I will preserve that, as I said, also in our Google Doc without attribution where it's public. So I want to begin, because I wanted to take this kind of chronologically, I want to begin on a point that I'm going to come back to, and I'll explain why. Beginning in India, with Indian materialism, which first appeared around 500 BCE as an opponent of supernaturalism in some of the religions of the time. It didn't become a formal school of thought until much later. So we're going to come back to it when we get up to the 6th and 7th centuries CE. And that's when it can be properly called by the name of the school, the Charvaka or the Lokayata school of philosophy. And so stay tuned, we'll return to it then. Instead, around the same time, we're going to move over to China and look at somebody whose name you know, Confucianism, Confuci, Latinized as Confucius, who lived from 551 to 479 BCE. And the teachings, of course, and various incarnations of the Confucian philosophy were influential for centuries after that, and they're still influential. Now, to some, Confucius might have been very concerned about ritual, concerned about veneration of ancestors, and so on, that don't necessarily make us think humanism. But it's a humanist philosophy in a few senses. One, it emphasizes self-cultivation. So the comments that people made about humans having to develop humanity, that's very much an idea of Confuci. He emphasized the relationship between humans and the natural world. And the ultimate virtue in Confucianism is Ren, often translated humaneness or goodness or personhood. It's like saying, you know, be a mensch, be a person, is the goal of being a person. And so I want to share just a few of the Confucian Analects teachings about Ren. One is that Ren means to love your fellow men. That might sound familiar. Another important teaching about it that really resonates with humanism down the ages is that it requires thought. It requires reason and discernment. You can't just follow tradition. So here's another way that the word Ren shows up. Sometimes it's translated as a gentleman, sometimes as a superior person. So here we go. When the superior person, the Analects say, deals with the world, he is not biased for or against anything. He just follows what is right. So letting go or re-examining preconceived notions, very important, and you're very humanist. Furthermore, the superior person is in harmony but does not merely conform. The inferior person merely conforms but is not in harmony. Now, there's no deity as such in Confucianism, but there are spirits, there's the veneration of the ancestors, ritual is important, music is important. And Ren isn't seen by Confucius as being incompatible with these things, but it's more important. And here I'm quoting a scholar. Where Confucius clearly innovated was in his rationale for performing the rites in music. By contrast with the zoo practices with which he grew up, early discussions between Confucius and his disciples described benefits of ritual performance that went beyond the propitiation of spirits, rewards from the ancestors, or the maintenance of the social or cosmic order. Instead of emphasizing goods that were external to the performer, like these works stressed the value of the associated interior psychological states of the practitioner. And that makes total sense with Confucianism as a humanist philosophy, because the goal of this philosophy is to become a sage, to become a wise person. And actually, it's interesting, just like Plato at a similar time in a very different part of the world, Confuci thought that the ideal ruler would be a sage ruler, like a philosopher king. Mencius, as he's Latinized, one of the most important Confucians, came along a few generations later. He lived from 385 to 303 BCE. And he added something else that's maybe very well known to us through some humanisms. He proposed a positive view of human nature. Mencius is known for his view that, and please pardon me, everybody, for my absolutely atrocious Chinese pronunciation. I'm totally guessing. He's known for his view that Xing, usually translated as nature or human nature, is good, spelled here Xing. He believes that in everyone's natural endowment there is an organ that called Xin, heart and mind, that carries with it 4 inborn seeds for moral behavior: the heart of compassion, the sense of shame and disgust, the sense of compliance and respect, and the sense of right and wrong. These seeds are not infused into people from outside, but were there from the beginning. So we have the ingredients that we need to become a sage, to become a good person, the superior person. They're inborn. And when these seeds grow and become mature, they turn into 4 major virtues that are all aspects of Ren. Now, when Mencius says that human nature is good, he doesn't mean we don't have any aspects that are evil or morally neutral. He's just saying we have these seeds within us, and then the flourishing leads to becoming a noble person, to having the quality of Ren. Not all Confucians shared this positive view of human nature, but his is very influential and was in place very early on in the philosophy. So now moving over around the same time, but to this other part of the world, to Greece, I want to pull out the philosophy of Protagoras, who lived 490 to 420 BCE. Of course, these usually are approximate dates, but these early dates. And there's basically 2 things that I want to pull out about Protagoras that sound very, that cause him to be called a humanist. One is he has a relativist epistemology. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge, how we can know things, what we can know. And he's very relativistic. It depends on the person. Because the most famous saying of Protagoras is, man is the measure of all things. Forgive the sexism, but that's how he said it. Man is the measure of all things. Of the things that they are. Of the things that are not, that they are not. So it's like totally subjective. We are the measure of what we know and what we don't know. Now, in some ways, this very subjective epistemology is self-evident. We only know what we know. And in another, it's kind of problematic in that it introduces relativism, which makes you wonder, is there any objective truth? If there is an objective truth, can we perceive it? Does this mean we can't make any assertions about truth, that we're all just really asserting our own opinion, our own perceptions? But that's what he thought. And it also introduces radical doubt, that if everything comes down to our perceptions, then we have to really question our perceptions if we're to have any idea of what's actually out there in the world. There's a real double edge to this attitude. On the one hand, it's kind of an arrogant suggestion that whatever is true for us is true. On the other hand, there's a real humility in saying that we can only know what we perceive through our own various filters, beginning with the one that we're human. We see things the way humans see things. Another possible interpretation of this statement, man is the measure of all things, is that it's asserting a kind of anthropocentrism that puts human beings at the center of everything. And that's a danger of humanism that I think we should watch for and that we can keep paying attention to when it comes up and reevaluate. That in a way we can put Earth and this particular species of it at the center of creation. And that would be kind of ironic, because that's something that humanism can have in common with traditional theism, that this pale blue dot is the only thing that matters in the whole universe. What a coincidence, but it's where we are. So all of that is about Protagoras' epistemology. The other thing that really makes him notable as a humanist is his agnosticism about God. And he laid this one right out, or at least as recorded by Diogenes Laertius, this is what he said. As to gods, I have no means of knowing either that they exist or do not exist. For many are the obstacles that impede knowledge, both the obscurity of the question and the shortness of human life. That, to me, that follow-up seems to suggest that he has rather the more humble view of what we can know. Life is short and questions are difficult, so we don't know if there's a God or not, or more than one. By the way, there's a common story that he was exiled from Athens because of this impiety, but it seems to be a myth. You'll be happy to know. There are contemporary accounts of his life, including Plato's. Plato has a dialogue called Protagoras, in which Protagoras appears as an old man and a distinguished Athenian philosopher. So unless that's wish fulfillment on Plato's part, which seems unlikely considering their disagreements, Protagoras was never kicked out of Athens. Now this brings us to somebody else in Greece, Epicurus. You may know the Epicurean school of philosophy. It's named after him. He lived from 341 to 270 BCE, and he was humanist in these three respects. One, of this worldliness. Two, materialism, and I'll expand in a moment on what that means. And three, a focus on human existence, though interestingly not because he doesn't believe in a God. So first, this worldliness of Epicureanism. In Epicurus's thought, which was highly developed, even though we have almost all of it from later sources, because very little of his original writing survives, but his disciples wrote up what he believed. He had a very complex philosophy touching on ethics and metaphysics and all sorts of things. And one of the things he said is that the soul is material, it's corporeal. And that has two important consequences. One, it means the soul isn't immortal. It dies when the body dies. And he says it this way: the soul's texture is too delicate to exist independently of the body that contains it. And in any case, the connection with the body is necessary for sensation to occur. From this it follows that there can be no punishment after death, nor any regrets for the life that has been lost. Now, you might take note, if you, like me, are a fan of Philip Pullman's trilogy, His Dark Materials, and the TV series made from it. This is a world where the soul is visible and embodied in the form of an animal called a demon. And when we die, our demons just blink out of existence like the light does when the light bulb is smashed. So the soul is real, but it can't go on after the body goes on, to Epicurus. A second implication of this idea that the soul is the same stuff as the material world is that the soul is responsive to physical impressions. So this is what's meant by materialism in philosophy, that there are no mental phenomena. There are no purely spiritual phenomena. It's not like there's a material world and a spiritual world. There's just material. Everything that exists comes out of matter in some way. So there aren't any phenomena, according to Epicurus, that are disembodied states or objects of pure consciousness conceived as separate from embodiment. And if you're having trouble wrapping your mind around that, well, philosophically, Epicurus is responding to somebody in particular. He's responding to Plato, who thought of ideas and forms, ideal forms, as being real. In fact, as being more real than the material world. And that everything that we know in the material world is a kind of pale reflection of these ideas, which are true reality. Anyway, so important to know that materialism is not, in this case, an ethical or economic idea. It's not about acquiring physical things, material stuff. It's a belief about the nature of reality. Now, having said that for Epicurus nothing exists but matter, I just need to explain a major exception, again, of interest to people who are interested in humanism, and where does it fit in with the whole God thing? Epicurus declared that there were gods who were ethereal beings without any material existence, but because they were completely immaterial, they could not influence humans. He said, "A blessed and eternal being has no trouble himself and brings no trouble upon any other being. Hence he is exempt from movements of anger and partiality, for every such movement implies weakness." So it's a vision of God as being so radically apart from human life as to be largely irrelevant. I just remembered something I wanted to say to you all before we began, and that's that I'm going to carry on talking, and any thoughts that you have that you want to jot down, please jot them down in the chat, and we'll get to them at our discussion time. But an exception is if you are totally not following something that I just said, then please raise the little blue hand or wave wildly, and I'll see you, and stop me. Okay. Another thing about Epicureanism, this is a bit of a tangent, but again, I think it really plays into how we think about humanism going forward. For a long time, Epicureanism was an insult, especially coming from religious people. And some of that, I think, was because of this suspiciously absent God. You Epicurean, you know, different Christian sects would accuse each other of really being Epicureans at heart. But also, I think, the focus on pleasure and happiness that is the heart of Epicurus' thought was held to be equivalent to the worst kind of hedonism. Just pursuing one's own pleasure and the rest of the world to be damned. And this is unjust. Although Epicurus and Epicureans did consider pleasure the goal of life, it is far from an immoral or even an amoral philosophy. The pursuit of pleasure of both body and mind is compatible with, in fact, inseparable from ethics. Here's how Epicurus puts it. It is impossible to live a pleasant life without living wisely and well and justly. And it is impossible to live wisely and well and justly without living a pleasant life. By pleasure, he says, we mean the absence of pain in the body and of trouble in the soul. It is not an unbroken succession of drinking bouts and of revelry, not sexual love, not the enjoyment of the fish and other delicacies of a luxurious table, which produce a pleasant life. It is sober reasoning, searching out the grounds of every choice and avoidance, and banishing those beliefs through which the greatest tumults take possession of the soul. One of the charges leveled against humanism is that it lacks a moral anchor. And so here we see Epicurus, many years after he was gone, being accused of just that. And so it's worthwhile to notice that assertion, that really clear, plain assertion, that what he means by pleasure, by happiness, is to live wisely and well and justly. That there is a moral anchor without which we cannot be truly happy. All right, let us resume. And thanks, I think everybody once again muted who isn't speaking at the moment, so that's great. Okay, so we've been in Greece, so the next place, of course, is Rome. Very influenced by Greek philosophy, and I'm just going to touch base there, touch down on two people, really mostly one. Lucretius was his short name, Titus Lucretius Carus, who lived 98, again, approximately 98 to 55 BCE. He was a follower of Epicurus, and in fact, it's largely through Lucretius that we know a lot of Epicurus's thought. And he kind of lays it right out there. Here's a quote from his major book on the nature of things. It's called De Rerum Natura, and my pronunciation of Latin isn't a lot better than my pronunciation of Chinese. Nature, free at once and rid of her haughty lords, is seen to do all things spontaneously of herself, without the meddling of the gods. So we're seeing another opposite setup here. Nature versus the gods. We don't need no stinking gods. We've got nature. We've got the natural world. So Lucretius was a very outspoken critic of religion. He said, nothing is ever gotten out of nothing by divine power. So there goes one of the assertions of religion, that the creation ex nihilo is exactly what gods do. He says no. But then he goes on to talk about the evils of superstition, of religion. He says, and he's writing to like his readership, I think he's like sort of addressing, here are the people I'm trying to teach, my followers. One thing that worries me, he says, is the fear that you may fancy yourself embarking on an impious course, setting your feet on the path of sin in following him, right? Okay. Far from it. More often, it is very superstition that is the mother of sinful and impious deeds. And then he gives this heartrending description of a story from the Trojan War, of Iphigenia being brought to the altar to be sacrificed in order to placate Artemis and give her father, Agamemnon, favorable winds to go to Troy. He gives this really beautiful and very, very sad description of Iphigenia, and then he says, "Such are the heights of wickedness to which men are driven by superstition." So, for wisdom and hope, he advises us to turn to nature. And this is Lucretius speaking again. "For as children tremble and fear everything in the blind darkness, so we in the light sometimes fear what is no more to be feared than the things that children in the dark hold in terror and imagine will come true. This terror, therefore, and darkness of mind must be dispelled not by the rays of the sun and glittering shafts of daylight, but by the aspect and law of nature." So you might wonder, what is the role of religion to these Roman humanist types? And Ovid has an interesting thing to say about that. He's a poet, of course. He was born not long after Lucretius's death. He lived about 43 to 17, says. Boy, that's a short life. And he had this to say: "It is convenient that there be gods, and as it is convenient, let us believe that there are." That has a little sound of Pascal's wager to me, of let's believe in God just in case. But I'm also thinking that here it's talking about, the whole problem of how humanist philosophy is to fit in with religion. There was clearly a conventional role for religion in Roman society that even skeptical thinkers accepted. And maybe for some it had more of a literary and cultural purpose rather than being an accurate guide to truth. In any case, that's what these two had to say about it. So now we're back to India, as promised, to the Charvaka, which is the name of one of the founders of this school of thought, also known as the Lokayata, the philosophy of the people. We're in the 6th and 7th century CE now. And the original text, going way back to around 500 BCE, were called the Bharaspatya Sutras, meaning they're the wisdom of Bharaspati, who lived in the Vedic era, about 1500 BCE, ending around 500 BCE, the time of the Vedas. At the time, these sutras, again, we have just fragments. At the time, they were offered as alternatives to Jainism and Hinduism and Buddhism. Specifically, they were rejecting Vedic teachings about the gods, the belief that the world was created and guided by the gods. And it was much later that this philosophy flowered. Some of the tenets of what is called the Indian materialist school is perception is the only source of knowledge. Sounds a little like Protagoras. This school of thought refutes supernaturalism, and also, maybe you might say therefore, does not believe in an immortal soul or transcendent gods. Like Epicurus, the Indian materialists believe in a soul, but they believe the soul dies with the body. Either there's different thoughts about that, either it arises from the material world or it's a kind of material being itself. In any case, it's mortal. It's not this immortal part of us that goes on and on. The Charvaka school had a teleological understanding of the universe. Teleology is the belief of the goal-oriented, the purpose. So that means the universe was not brought into being with a purpose. It evolved. Nature forms nature. Who knows how far back it goes? It wasn't that the gods called it into being in order to make something happen. Not surprisingly, this school rejects the authority of the scriptures, such as the Vedas. It is materialist, Like Epicurus, nothing exists but the material. And it's hedonistic. It's focused on pleasure and this world. Now, we might more fairly call this a form of Epicureanism, which, as I said, is a very deep sort of pleasure, right? A belief that you can't really be happy if you are only pursuing pleasures of the flesh, or if you're being cruel or unethical. Now, as I said, there's just fragments known about Charvaka, and I'm learning a lot about how it's understood from this encyclopedia, which might be pretty critical of it, but in general, Indian materialism comes under fire from a lot of Indian schools of thought. So this encyclopedia of Indian philosophy says that in Charvaka it is distinctly egoistic hedonism. It is unconcerned with the welfare of society as a whole. And I quote, "Indian materialism regards pleasure in itself and for itself as the only good, and thus promotes hedonistic practices. Furthermore, it rejects a utilitarian approach to pleasure. Utilitarianism regards pleasure, both higher and lower, as the ultimate good, and therefore promotes the maximization of the good on a collective level. But Indian materialism rejects this move away from pure egoism. The doctrine suggests that individuals have no obligation to promote the welfare of society and would only tend to do so if it were to ultimately benefit them as well." Now, I do not know whether this is a fair characterization of this school of thought. As I said, there are only fragments of the foundational texts, and the only translation from the Sanskrit that I've been able to get a hold of is in rhymed verse. It's called the Carvaka 60 by Dr. Tanvir Ratul, which clearly sacrifices a lot of nuance to the need to make a rhyme. I would really love to read a prose translation and learn more about this school of thought. And it's risky to judge a philosophy by its critics. However, this does stand as a fair warning that a humanist philosophy has to guard against egoism and nihilism, the view that there is no justification for morality or values. Again, this is a criticism that can be made, is often made by theists against atheists, by traditionalists against humanists of all kinds, although, as I repeat, humanism has and is a tradition as well. That if we cut ourselves off from some roots of morality, we're left unconnected to any morality whatsoever. And it was really touched on this in our discussion, but I want to give a few of the humanist answers, if they haven't been obvious already. Because, it makes sense to the Mormon or whoever, to somebody whose morality grows from a belief in a transcendent God who is the good and who guides us to the good. It's understandable that the question arises, so what tells you what is good and what is bad? And the humanist response as early as the 5th century BCE is that our morality can be, or even must be, grounded in something different. So for Epicurus, it's our pursuit of pleasure, combined with a rational and very self-examining turn of mind, so that we know whether we're really say, pursuing short-term pleasure instead of thinking for the long term what is going to actually be better for us. That we're really applying reason and ethical concern to this ethical imperative of pursuing pleasure. Confucius suggests that the basis of morality is to reflect on our own humanity and treat others with the same regard. Ritual is secondary to the golden rule, to treating one another with the kinds of ways we want to be treated. And of course, there's always Lucretius to point out that belief in God can send one down a distinctly immoral path, such as the sacrifice of Iphigenia. And we can all think of half a dozen cases without even trying of the terrible things that people do, saying that they were so ordered by God, or that they're told to by their religion. So it's complicated. But anyway, let's take it as a warning and a reminder that if one abandons one structure of morality and truth-seeking, one has to find another one. And here is my chance to quote one of my favorite philosophers, Bob Dylan: "To live outside the law, one must be honest." So I'm going going to come up to two things, two kinds of humanism. They're called humanism, have been called for a long time, and have quite a different ring to them. So we're moving up to the 10th century to the Middle East, particularly Baghdad, where it really flowered, and the Buyid dynasty from 945 to 1055. But in general, this is the heart of the golden age of Islam, as it's called. And philosophical humanism in the Muslim world embraced the scientific and philosophical heritage of classical antiquity of Greece and Rome as a cultural and educational ideal. So this was a time when there was a veritable explosion of scientific knowledge in the Muslim world that spread to the rest of the world. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and travel and trade brought Muslims into communication with North Africa, with the lands shaped by Greece and Rome, to Persia, and then west to Andalusia, Spain. And the mutual influence was profound. Muslim scholars sought to integrate what they were learning from these ancient philosophers into their world and their Muslim worldview. So two philosophers in particular from this period of Islam are people I want to pull out. One is Ibn Sina. It's westernized as Avicenna. He was Persian, lived about 980 to 1037. He was a philosopher, a physician, an astronomer, a writer. He was very well versed in Aristotle, and he wanted to reconcile Islamic theology with reasoned philosophy. For example, he wanted to scientifically and rationally prove the existence of God. And he was so influential in the world of Islam that, I mean, he's still one of the greatest intellectuals of world history, and certainly in the Muslim world. But that project of having a rational counterpart to religious revelation, as seen in the Quran, meant that Islamic religious schools taught his work for at least 800 years. These are religious schools that wanted to teach this very rational scientific philosophy. That's Avicenna, Ibn Sina. And then there's 100 years later, and at the other end of the Muslim world of the Golden Age, Ibn Rushd, pronounced in the Latinization Averroes, lived in Cordoba, Spain, from 1126 to 1198. He argued for the separation of science and philosophy on the one hand and theology on the other. Now that might sound like a completely opposite project to Ibn Sina, to Avicenna's, but they believed something very similar. Averroes believed that if one practices philosophy with reason and logic, it will not conflict with religious revelation, because he believed these are both approaches to truth, and truth cannot contradict truth. So pursuing philosophical proofs or philosophical examinations of religious revelation wasn't a way of testing religious belief. It showed a trust in its solidity. And so there's this belief in the Muslim Golden Age that philosophy should be the backbone of theology, that we shouldn't rely solely on faith or revelation, and religious expression shouldn't be primarily ritual and worship, or only ritual and worship. It's ethical. Being a religious person, being a good Muslim, means you have an ethical expression. It's relational, how humans relate to one another and coexist in this world. So in that sense, it was a humanistic form of Islam. And Averroes in particular could be said to be laying the foundation of later secularism in the Muslim world. The idea that secular science and government and literature and philosophy and so on have their own life alongside the religious. That there's a secular world alongside the religious world. Now, in an interesting parallel to this Muslim humanism, we come to Europe and the Renaissance and what is called Renaissance humanism. Now, just like Islam, the Renaissance humanists, who didn't always call themselves humanists, but some of them did, They were not atheists. They were not atheistic at all. They saw their religion and reason as compatible, and they sought to prove it. They also had this deep respect for the use of reason, and so they were looking back at Greek and Roman philosophers and adopting their methods because they used reason to make inferences from first principles. In other words, these Renaissance Christian thinkers were not just looking to the Bible. They were looking to pagan philosophers. Pagan in the sense not of neo-pagan, but in the sense of not Christian or Jewish or Muslim. They now Islamic philosophy also influenced Renaissance Christian humanism. Ibn Sina, for example, Avicenna, was an exemplar for many Renaissance thinkers. He studied Aristotle, and in turn he influenced Western Europe, so that actually the Europeans absorbed the Greek and Roman teachings oftentimes via the golden age of Islam. Like it went round to Persia and back. Dante so revered him that he put Ibn Sina among the righteous non-Christians in his Divine Comedy. Renaissance humanism was also humanist or humanistic, which I know is not exactly the same thing. So we can talk about whether we think this is a humanist idea. It had this very strong desire to enlighten all people through learning, through thought and scholarship, not have learning restricted to monastics, as it had been in Europe for centuries. So here's a rather rosy description of the Renaissance humanists from the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy. Here one felt no weight of the supernatural pressing on the human mind, demanding homage and allegiance. Humanity, with all its distinct capabilities, talents, worries, problems, possibilities, was the center of interest. It has been said that medieval thinkers philosophized on their knees, but bolstered by the new studies, they dared to stand up and to rise to full stature. So that might be a little bit simplistic. I mean, who am I to criticize the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy, but I think they're getting a little carried away with their rhetoric here. Because these were God-believing people, and the Bible, what you learned had to be in keeping with your biblical teachings. However, it is true to say that in Renaissance humanism, humanity was the center of interest. It's not all about the glory of God. It is a very human-centered philosophy. And like the Muslims that I just cited, they didn't see this as a contradiction. They were trying to bring it all together. They thought it belonged all together. So I'll just quote one person, Erasmus, who was a critic of the church and a Catholic reformer, although, of course, one can be a reformer within one's church and not be a humanist. But Erasmus, who was Dutch and lived from 1469 to 1536, he was called the Prince of Humanists, the Prince of Christian Humanists. He applied these ancient pagan teachings of the Greek and Roman thinkers in the light of Christianity. Epicurus's teachings were just being discovered around this time. And as I said, Epicureanism became an insult that different Christian sects hurled at each other. But Erasmus claimed it as a title that he wanted. And I'm going to read to you at some length what he wrote. If people who live agreeably are Epicureans, none are more truly Epicurean than the righteous and godly. And if it is names that bother us, no one better deserves the name of Epicurean than the revered founder and head of the Christian philosophy, Christ. For in Greek, epikuros means helper. He alone, when the law of nature, remember that phrase, when the law of nature was all but blotted out by sins, brought timely aid to perishing humanity. Completely mistaken, therefore, are those who talk in their foolish fashion about Christ having been sad and gloomy in character and calling upon us to follow a dismal mode of life. On the contrary, he alone shows the most enjoyable life of all and the one most full of true pleasure. So there you have the term Christian humanism in a nutshell. It obviously doesn't mean a humanism as in equaling atheism, or even a humanism focused on the human, not the godly. But for Erasmus, it was humanism focused on the development and enjoyment of human life. The Renaissance humanists saw theism, specifically Christianity, as being compatible with human happiness and fulfillment. In fact, they saw the two projects. So we have a project of worship of God and pursuit of pleasure. They saw them as being intertwined and inseparable. So, anybody who's trying to set up this God versus nature idea, we have these natural impulses and this desire to live in this beautiful world and pursue the pleasures of sunshine and good food and sex and so on. The law of God to these thinkers is the law of nature. Here's Erasmus again. He's saying, Christ alone, when the law of nature was all but blotted out by sins, saved perishing humanity. So they're just not having it. They're saying there is not a conflict between the concern for human goodness, human happiness, and biblical precepts.